So thanks for coming today. Mm-hmm. I want to thank you because I'm glad you're here. Because the political landscape has been changing for a long time. And I think as, you know, if you ask an American what politics is, I think everybody's definition of that word is different. And I think we don't really question what politics is in the first place, right?
Right.
So people have just this conceived idea of, as soon as we talk about politics, we're talking about Democrats and Republicans, like, you know, I hate Trump, I love Biden, I hate Trump, whatever it is, right? It's just purely political in that sense. And I don't think people have an idea, and myself included here, I'm here to learn, on what is politics, kind of how we use it in our day-to-day and how that definition kind of changes. So I'm glad I got an expert here to help us shed some light on this. So, well, why don't you tell me a little bit about you, kind of what got you into, tell me about your book, what got you into political science, and just everything. Yeah.
Sure. So I was born here in Irving, but pretty much grew up in Appalachia. And my first political memory was when I was very young, the first Lebanon War. And then I would watch political programs. I'd come home as a high school student and watch Crossfire, Capital Gang, McLaughlin Group. That's another very early memory, was my father watching McLaughlin Group.
What was that?
Oh gosh, well, it was these talk shows that was on. It was a very different landscape pre-internet, with political talk shows, because they had people who disagreed talking to each other and having a debate, which we don't have anymore. I mean, since 2006, there was a real shift, and the internet, I think, causes the shift towards, we're going to make a profit on a niche audience.
Right.
But I grew up with something very different, which was on a nightly basis, this back and forth argument, but civil discourse. We're disagreeing, but we can air our disagreements. It was fascinating. They have prime minister's questions in England that hooks people on politics. John Major, I got to meet him, and that's what he said when he was a child. He saw prime minister's questions and was kind of hooked. And so I grew up in a small town in Appalachia and kind of saw, the impact that local politics can have too, just the huge impact of the decisions that are made for good or for ill. My parents raised me with good principles too, just talking about things that were happening at work and, decisions people were making and how that was impacting.
Well, that helps.
The ethos and how things are done, and so so I was hooked. So I majored in political science and then became an academic, and then got involved in maybe the most political thing of all, which is administration. So having to lead faculties at universities, very political role, which slows down your production, that limits the teaching you can do, slows down the research and writing production.
Right. Because you're the dean of Constantin College.
I am, yeah. So I was able to come back to Dallas, come back to Irving in an administrative role. And it's, the fun part of being at a college is doing the teaching and then doing your own thinking, research, and writing, which I'm not able to do as much of. But I kind of justified it to myself that I am in politics department, so I'm trying to see if these theories actually work. I can put them into practice and try them out. And so over the last decade and a half, I have been meditating on these types of questions, like what is politics, and what should it be aiming for? And so the result was this book that got published this year, Against Values, it's called.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about that book. The general message, I think that you want to impart when people read your book.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So originally, it was designed as, I'm going to investigate this, turn of phrase that politicians use and we use when we're talking about politics in terms of values, fundamental values, family values, things like that. Turns out it's a recent way of speaking. And where did it come from? Why did we start speaking this way? What difference does it make? That was kind of the initial idea behind the book. It did take me a decade and a half because it kind of ballooned into this greater project. Because I realized the first use of the term in this sense that we use it today was Thomas Hobbes. And there is no Thomas Hobbes without Martin Luther. Mm-hmm. So you have to go back 500 years to really understand what's going on. It became this meditation on modern political thought or liberalism, really well conceptualized by Thomas Hobbes.
So what were the main ideas that Thomas Hobbes was imparting, and how did you use that to kind of shape your book?
Oh, you asked me about the takeaway too, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the main idea really is of sovereignty. So the modern political thought centers around this idea, I would argue, of sovereignty. And it's a funny thing because it's almost like this magical concept where you have a seat of power that's this unified authority that everyone is forced to agree with and that is always right. So that's the idea that we have kind of stuck with, right? The sovereign state, right. That our world is divided up geopolitically into these states. They're sovereign, they have territoriality, and they make their own decisions. They're autonomous. And the idea is that there's this conflict that people can't agree. I mean, at basis, it's this idea that you and I are searching for our own values, our own ends, gaining esteem for ourselves. That brings us into conflict with each other. We can't agree. So then the state has to come in and kind of have a settlement, kind of force us to agree.
As to what the laws should be, essentially.
As to what the laws should be, but even what the truth of the matter is. So that's the argument. It's a very powerful way to conceptualize things because even to this day, we see things in this terms. We think of politics in terms of conflict, in terms of disagreement, in terms of ideological struggle. And we think of politics in terms of the state. So even when we use that word, we're talking about the government.
Right.
But when you reflect on it, politics is really everywhere. It's in every organization. It's not just in the government. It's just human beings having to work with each other to make a decision on what they're going to do. And that happens through this process of suggestion response.
Right.
So I am enamored of this 20th century political thinker who I think is the most underrated 20th century political thinker, Bertrand de Jouvenel, who was French and who wrote really excellent books. The Pure Theory of Politics is the one I would recommend. It's very well-written, simple, elegant, almost deceptively easy to read, but brilliant. And he talks about this idea of politics as suggestion response. So when you have a group of people and you need to decide what to do, and I tell my students, you're with your friends, and the question is, what are we going to do on a Saturday night? Somebody has to instigate. Somebody has to come up with an idea. Well, let's go watch a movie, and has to try to convince the other people. So there's an instigator. There's a time lapse between when that instigation happens and when the decision happens. But the people have to respond. So there's always has to be this response that is the kingmaker. So you can't be a leader without having people who are following you.
Right.
And leaders know that. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt has this great quote where he says, it's a terrifying thing as a leader to look over your shoulder and not see anybody there. And good leaders kind of can make this pretense that their authority and everyone's following them. It's just kind of inevitable. You have to obey if you don't like it because this is what everyone has to do. But really, power is always this reciprocal relationship.
Sure.
And even the most powerful person or organization is dependent on people following those suggestions, following those instigations. Big, powerful car manufacturer, people still have to respond and buy the cars. So yeah, politics is everywhere. It's not just the government. It's not just the state. And when you analyze response, people respond for different reasons. Could be that they like the content of what you're suggesting. It could be that they like you. Right? So if there's something they really don't want to do, somebody really doesn't want to do, maybe they will do it out of loyalty to the person. So this is kind of the key idea of my book, is the one takeaway I think a reader of the book can get out of it is the importance of this neglected idea of loyalty. Because we think in modern political thought a lot about rights and power and separation of power and sovereignty and all of these things. But at its fundamental level, are you going to respond to suggestion? That's the concrete reality.
Right.
And we want that to be voluntary. We want people to comply without having to try to force them to do it, because that bogs everything down really quickly, and you can't have a society that way if you're trying to force people to do things. You want voluntary compliance. That's what the aim of good government is.
Yeah, I think a good leader can help facilitate that, obviously a little bit. But coming back to the values idea that you'd mentioned earlier, everybody has such different values, right, as to what they or ideals, or what they constitute as being right or wrong. And so how do you reconcile those? There's no way around. For example, I'll just take a controversial topic: abortion. Right? Some people have they believe it is murder to kill a fetus while it's in the mother's stomach, while others who are pro-choice think the opposite. And there's this distinct, just complete opposite kind of this value system that I don't think could ever change. So how do we navigate around those waters? And do we even need to navigate around those? Like, what is the role of government and values, and how do they play together?
Yeah, great question. So you've articulated it. This is how we think and speak in modernity. We're fundamentally individuals. What does it mean to be an individual? We choose our own comprehensive doctrine. We choose our own religion. We have our own values. We have our own worldview. We have all this language to describe it. We can't get everyone to agree.
Right.
It's impossible to force everyone to agree. And if you're believing in these passionately, and there's this passionate disagreement, well, that can break out into violence. So you need to have a third party, the sovereign state, to kind of step in, separate out these passionate ideological believers, and have a rule of law and impose a settlement. So that's the idea. I mean, and that's automatically how we think. So, I mean, let's take the first thing. Are we fundamentally individuals with these set in stone ideological worldviews? Well, that's not, political scientists know that's not actually how real politics on the ground kind of works. I mean, just for example, if you have a newly elected representative to Congress versus someone who has been there for 2 decades, you have 2 very different scenarios, because the person who has been there has a lot of preferences built up about what they want to do, what they want to accomplish. Whereas the newbie doesn't know anything yet and has to learn what exactly they want to do.
Right.
So as human beings, we kind of don't know what we want. we have to be, desires are taught. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, are we locked into this intractable conflict necessarily, and it comes to our disagreement. Well, actually, I would say, the activity of politics is precisely bringing people together who disagree peacefully.
Right.
Through suggestion response, through leadership, through that art of persuasion. People say it all the time. Oh, I have a friend who totally disagrees with me. I have a family member who totally disagrees with me. I love them, and we're still friends.
Right.
So that is the phenomenon. As I was, meditating on these questions and thinking about this question of values, that I realized, wow, and because if there's one topic in modern political thought that's left out, that's suppressed, that's not talked about, it's friendship. And it's a really strange thing because it was it's this dominant theme in ancient and medieval political thought, right? St. Thomas Aquinas says the definition of a tyrant is someone who's not friends with the citizens. Aristotle's beautiful reflections on friendship, book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics, like the whole point of the good life is friendship. Why are we trying to be excellent people? Why are we trying to develop virtue? Is it because we want other people to esteem us, because we want power over them? That's Thomas Hobbes's answer. That's his anthropology. That's what he thinks is driving us all.
That's kind of bleak.
It's a bleak, a bleak vision.
Yeah, but for some, I think that's the truth. For a lot of people, I think it depends on the level of narcissism in the person, right? What their esteem and what their viewpoint on influence and what their definition of what power is, because you can have two people with very different definitions of what the word power is, right?
And that's why, the great Greek thinkers on politics, Plato and Aristotle, so they are take Plato's Republic. When they're talking about these questions, Plato has Socrates say, boy, it's really difficult to talk about these questions on an individual level. Like you're saying, well, it all depends on the definition. Every person's different. Everyone's situation is different. So what does Plato do? He constructs this whole dialogue, the Republic, on the basis of this question: why don't we, instead of trying to answer the question for an individual, look at an entire community, look at an entire society? Because it's like reading if we enlarge the letters, we can read them more clearly instead of this really small, subtle things that are going on with each individual. And so I would say the same thing, that yes, everybody's different. Everyone has different situations, different desires, and we could say in a lot of cases, this is legitimate, right? Depending on your circumstances of life and what you're trying to accomplish. So isn't everything relative? Isn't everyone have their own values? But when you blow that up to a whole society, now it's kind of easier to see that there is really a difference between a peaceful, ordered society where people are friends,
right,
and a society that is full, you can imagine, full of people who are self-seeking, power-hungry, stab you in the back type of people.
Right.
Like, if you think about those two scenarios, do I want to go work at a company that's where people are friends, or they're trying to stab each other in the back? Do I want to live in a neighborhood where people are friends, or where you have to lock your doors at night and arm yourself, right? So there it's easy to see that, and I think the whole distinction subjective, objective, that's another kind of effect of this modern way of looking at things. It's either subjective or it's objective. Well, a relationship is neither. A friendship is neither. But there is an objective difference, we could say, between these two societies, a flourishing society and one that is not flourishing.
Yeah. Friendship itself a lot of it is a value that starts with, within your community, right? And something that I believe that you can be taught in that aspect. I think today, though, the mentality is changed. where, I mean, people are defriending each other on Facebook. They're not talking to their relatives because they have different views of opinion in politics. And so that landscape's really changed. And I'm of the same mindset as you. I'd much rather have a civil conversation with somebody that I disagree with and hope that it gets somewhere, or at least agree that we disagree on certain things. But a lot of people, that's enough to sever a friendship. So, so social media's got to be for me the big reason why probably that shift has happened. Maybe in the last 15 years, I'm not sure if there's other factors that you think has caused this kind of divisiveness and people not wanting to debate, and instead of opening their ears and opening their mind. Politically, my viewpoints have changed a lot in the last 10 years. And I try to have an open mind for that reason, because I realize that my viewpoints have changed and they could change. And so listening to differing opinions and respecting those opinions and trying your best to see yourself from their perspective is the best way. But more so than that level of respect to have. So what's happened to that? Why is that changed?
Boy, you really articulated it really well. To me, that's kind of this flaw of liberalism in action. This modern political thought that we're seeking after values rather than seeking after relationships. Because I would say that a friendship is not a value. A friendship is a real thing.
Right.
I have a good relationship with someone, or I don't have a good relationship. We trust each other, or we don't trust each other. And it's not subjective. It's not objective. It's not a value because it's not just, I esteem that person.
Right.
And in the book, I say that's the stalker relationship. When you esteem someone so highly and you're following them around and you're convincing yourself that you're in this relationship with them. Well, that is, in your own mind, that's not real. So relationships are real. And the problem is in modern political thought, in this liberal model of we're all individuals, we have our own desires, we're at odds with each other, and we need the state. In that model, we're not admitting friendship. We're not admitting what all previous political philosophy thought it was going after, which is how can we all be friends with each other? And then that is just exposed. That kind of low trust society that we have on some level then becomes exposed with the rise of the internet. Because people realize that they don't agree with each other. And then the question is, like, you're exactly what you're saying, like, what am I prioritizing? And again, we're conditioned to think about politics in terms of this priority of ideology. Like, right. We're like fighting these culture wars.
Well, it is important though, right? Is it not like the idea of ideology? Like maybe I'm just having a hard time seeing the difference between what creates a government of ideology and then what creates one without. Yeah. Like, because is it not necessary for governments to kind of form this ideologies? Like, take for example the war going on in Israel, right? You have two. You have a terrorist group, the Hamas, whose viewpoint is ideally that Jews must die. We must kill the Jews, and you can't really. Those are, you can call. I don't know if you'd call them those ideals, if you'd call them values, but there's no amount of friendship can reconcile the two, right? So the question is what do you do in instances like that? How could we ever reconcile something like that? Something that's as black and white as that, where people just like, there is no line to draw in the sand. I believe that you should be dead because of your race or your religion.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, that has to be a stop to that. There is such a thing as crime. There is such a thing as putting people in prison for crime.
Right.
Because they can't live in society. They can't live in the normal civic relationship with other people. But I think, there's a big difference though between, if we think of politics in terms of fighting for your beliefs, right? Fighting for this ideology. I'm not going to say it's not important. I agree with you. That's important. But is that all it is? No, it's the mode in which you do it. You can say exactly the same thing to a person
Right.
in a understanding, open way and in a derogatory, disrespectful way.
You're right.
And that is not something that we pay a whole lot of attention to, I think, because we don't think in those terms. We don't have that language. The modern political thought and liberalism has kind of stripped us from thinking of friendships and language and the quality of relationship and how we're treating each other as we disagree. But that's the critical thing, not so much where we land with any given policy.
That makes sense. That on that end for sure.
And the internet exacerbates that.
Oh man, totally. Yeah.
I mean,
People
you
will
learn
say
that.
anything. Yeah, people will say anything in front of behind their keyboard. They're willing to say anything to anybody behind the keyboards, So
And it comes off as harsh. There's no tone of voice. I mean, you learn that with, it's a cool kind of historical moment we're in where you experience pre-internet, at least I did, pre-internet era and an internet era. And, a comment or an email can just come off completely differently because there's not the person there.
Yeah, the tone makes a huge difference. You can't. Yeah. Sarcasm does not translate. I've seen that one get lost in translation lots of times, just on texts on Facebook, just via text. So I think a lot of that gets lost definitely in translation. So I think that's a big part of it. But going back to what you were saying about the extremes, right? Like respect and kindness towards the person that you're engaging with can go a long way because it can help you understand. It can help you see. You're much more likely to take someone's advice or opinion or just suggestions if it's worded in a respectful way. Nobody wants to be yelled or called an idiot and say, "Ha, told you, idiot," and then who's going to listen to that, right? So I definitely agree with that. And so treating the person that you're speaking to with respect is paramount in order to get any kind of change in agreement. When you come to the extremes of, like we were talking about earlier, murder and these fundamental values or ideals, values. Again, what's the word that we use in this case?
Yeah, we don't have a language for it.
These musts, these commandments, as you'd call them. If you were basing it off of religion or if you were basing it off of, for the most part, regardless of whether you're secular or whether you're religious, the idea of, don't kill somebody else, that's a pretty easy line in the sand to draw. So there are certain values that we have to agree on for a country to be able to flourish, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Is that true? I mean, do we all have to, again, these are the natural tropes that come to our lips when we're trying to conceptualize this, trying to think about it. But is it true? Do we have to have some kind of unanimity around some content of a doctrine in order then to flourish?
Well, one side's going to always disagree with whatever. If you have that arbiter, the law that's deciding whether or not, two people disagreeing on, say, I'll come back to abortion just because it's an easy one. People think it's murder. Other people think it's a personal choice. And for a lot of people, there's no compromise on that. It's like, I think a lot of people just believe it's murder and it's a personal choice. And I think there's certain levels of grace based on how late term, abortions work and stuff. There's debate around that. But from just a general standpoint, that's the case. So if certain states, make the laws that say, in this state, abortion is now legal, people who are pro-life will say that this is an immoral law, So how do we, I don't know if there's any way to juggle around that at all.
Well, you could be friends.
Right.
I mean, and pro-life and pro-choice people are friends all the time. So that, to me, that reality of friendship between people who disagree explodes this fundamental assumption that we have to have the state stepping in and making these decisions and passing a law just in order to keep us from fighting each other. Well, no. We have a lot more, we're not that alienated. We have a lot more capacity than that. We are able ourselves to be friends and to treat each other well, even though we disagree, without having a necessity for a sovereign to impose a law. And it feeds the conflict that it's supposedly stopping. So the whole idea is the modern state steps in and stops these religious wars, religious conflicts. So you have sovereignty. Everyone is forced to agree on what the sovereign says, because if there is no agreement, then we're just fighting each other. But then the question becomes, well, what's the content of what the sovereign is decreeing? What's the content of that law going to be? Exactly like you're saying, like these two sides don't agree, but there has to be a law. We all just have to agree with what the state says. Well, then there's going to be never-ending conflict about that, about what the content of that sovereign decision is going to be. So it's fomenting the same kind of religious conflict that it's supposedly saving us from. But when
you say the word and why do you mean that? Why do you say religious in that sense?
Right. So religious in the sense of very passionate attachment to a worldview, to a set of values, to a belief system. So that's what that term means to us, again, in modernity.
It's good.
But not in previous eras.
And I think it's good for people to understand that definition, because many things that aren't centered with a God in the traditional sense that we understand it can be a religion, right? When we have certain, when your entire life is, certain diets can be a religion, right? If you take it to a certain extent, carnivore diet, veganism, whatever it is, it can be part of your identity so much so that it becomes a religion in a sense. Is that what you mean by that? Something that can become, that creates these groups whose almost entire identities is circulated around this thing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so religion, I would say this, religion is a concept that doesn't really make much sense. So there's a great volume that was eye-opening for me, paradigm-shifting for me, by William Kavanaugh, The Myth of Religious Violence. And he just, in this volume, just says, okay, he goes through, how are we going to define this so-called phenomenon? Well, this person says it's this person says it's that. The problem is there is no definition you can give that is going to include the things we want to include, the religions that everyone knows are religions, and exclude the things we want to exclude, like nationalism, other things. And it leads to distorting effects when we're trying to apply this concept that we have that's a historically constituted concept post-Protestant Reformation onto other periods of history and other societies. So he has a section on Hinduism. Like, we're trying to think of this as a religion, and it just doesn't work. So what we mean when we say religion is, again, something in the last 500 years in the modern era where it's a doctrine. It's a belief about God and individuals can choose their own belief, can choose their own worldview. But that's not the meaning that the term had, certainly in the ancient world, not in the medieval era. And again, it's this focus on the individual as preformed choosing the set of desires and this.
What was the definition of religion prior to this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, in the Middle Ages, you'd say the term and be, oh, okay, you mean the virtue of piety, right? And in the ancient world, this isn't up to your individual choice. Right? This is not something up to your individual choice.
Right.
These are the gods of the city, and everybody has to follow these gods. And what are you talking about? Believe in it? Like if you said, well, do the ancient Romans believe in their gods? They just look at you and blink. What do you mean believe?
Believe it is.
These are the powers that we experience.
Right.
And the important thing are these external rites, and you've got to do these rites, right? You've got to have piety towards the gods of the city. And we have that today. We have the same phenomenon today.
Just more of them. And more, I mean.
Well, think about how we use these words. The economy, right? It's this power that we kind of are always worried about and thinking about and impacts us. We kind of have these high priests in the Federal Reserve and these certain ceremonies, and it has to be appeased. our democracy, right? Very, very concerned about this, right? Have to defend our democracy. Nobody, if someone from a time travel machine says, do you believe in the economy? You would just say, what do you mean, do I believe it? It is a reality. It is a force in the world of my life. It's not up to me to believe it or disbelieve it. Right. So that's what the gods were in this ancient world. And it's exactly what you're saying. I mean, it's an ancient, archaic phenomenon, archaic religion. There's this French theorist, René Girard, who I'd recommend. I think he's great on this. That yes, we have to be bound together, especially given these fierce social divisions. Like, what is going to bind us together? It has to be religious. And I reviewed a book by Yoram Hazony, really excellent book on conservatism, a rediscovery. But there's a moment in that book where he talks about, well, societies are based on a religion or a public philosophy. He's kind of alighting these things, right? So we have this sense that there has to be some common morality. Right. There's another term.
Belief system.
Right. Yeah. That we kind of all have to share this and have to be on the same page with this.
I mean, it would make it easier, the idea, if you think about it on paper. You think if more people have the same common values, and let's just say hypothetically every single person was X religion on the planet, well, it'd make it a lot easier for us to get along.
I don't know that that's true. I tell you what makes it easier for us to get along. We show respect and common decency, and we act in trustworthy ways, and we try to be friends with each other. Like, it's the ways we actually treat each other, actually speak to each other. And you were describing, this phenomenon of social media exposing people or breaking off relationships, and the politics of trolling and provocation and canceling, right? Stop that. Like, treat each other well. Like, that is real. The relationships are real. But these mythical values and morality and religion, if we just all agreed, is that going to make these divisions? I mean, where are these divisions coming from? They're coming from, René Girard would say, mimetic desire. So we're desiring the same thing. You mentioned the Israeli and Palestinians. Well, they want the same thing. They want the land. Right. And that is just basic to the human condition. I mean, Girard will say man is the being that doesn't know what he wants. So
I can relate to that.
We're not satisfied with, like animals, just we eat, sexual relations, place to lay down and sleep, and we're happy. Right. Like, we're open to the world and have all these desires. But what should we desire? We don't know.
Right.
So then what do? We look around us at what other people are desiring. And we're like, okay, well, they seem to be happy. So if we got what they have, then we would be happy too. So then you go and you try to take it. Whatever it is that they have that's making them so happy, you take it. Well, that brings you in conflict with them. Mm-hmm. So now you're fighting. And in that fight, there's a ratcheting spiral of violence because they'll be mad that you took their thing. They'll try to get it back, in the process hurt you. You'll feel like, oh my gosh, they're a bad person because they hurt me, they're immoral, so I'm going to hurt them back, and it just escalates. So that's mimetic conflict, which starts out from nothing, right? Just from you dissed me, like you're not giving me enough esteem. And that's what I think values comes down to. Values comes down to esteem. It's not a relationship, which always is mutual. Yeah. It's just a one-sided giving of esteem.
Right.
So then what happens with mimetic violence is you have a real problem when it is whole groups of people who are now fighting each other, especially when they're kind of equal in forces, because then the conflict will never end. If there's not a overwhelming victory by one side, then it's just going to be never-ending conflict. And what happens is the whole destruction of the entire society.
Right.
So ancient societies that don't have the state, that don't have a neutral third party, don't have a justice system, they are highly aware of this,
Right.
that they can kind of be destroyed.
And yeah, very volatile, right? Yeah, absolutely.
By other warring tribes. And so then what they do is they say, okay, well, how do we bring together these two groups of people that are at each other's throats, these warring tribes? And the answer is always you sacrifice a scapegoat. You find a common enemy, right? So what can unite us? We can blame all our troubles on a third party who is unlike us, who's different in some way, and very importantly, defenseless, because the cycle of violence can end there. We can sacrifice the scapegoat and then blame all our troubles or on this person poisoning the well or tricking us, and really we should be united in opposition to the scapegoat.
Which, well, World War II as an example with the Jews as an example, right? Bringing the Jews in. Or there's also the religious aspect of how religion can kind of bring people together as well. This obviously it can tear people apart, but also bring them together with, you know, the baptism of Vikings as they came to, you know, as they were you know, plaguing or attacking and ravaging, you know, England and the UK, and how that was one way to help bring, you know, two warring civilizations together. So religion can be, you know, again, I'm not very. My family's Jewish. I'm agnostic in belief personally. I'd like to believe in something. I made a video about that. But religion has brought societies together, and they do impart a certain set of values if taught correctly. You know, and the value of respecting others and being respectful is one of the arguments you made earlier about what can bring people together, respect and friendship. So, if not for religion, what are the ways that we can impart the value system of friendship and respect so that it can be, you know, it can be experienced as a whole in an entire nation? You know, let's just assume there's no religion, you know, in America. What would that? How do we create that value system?
Yeah, so you say as a whole, right?
Right.
Because that's to me that's archaic religion. That's archaic religion is trying to search for that wholeness. But it does really matter. I mean, the idea that, you know, we're going to have just a secular public sphere. I don't know if that's possible. I would say it's very desirable to not have archaic religion be driving politics. But it really matters what is your conception of God, right? Do you have an insecure God who's vengeful, who's partial? Or is God the source and summit of all human relationships, trying to bring people together in a comprehensive whole? So it really matters for the social order what people have as a conception of God.
Right.
But sure, no. Yeah. Yeah.
I see. I don't know what God means to me. That's the idea why I have a hard time believing in a God, is that I can't even define it. I've asked people as to what is the definition of God. Well, it's extremely personal, you know, and I think that, you know, if you have somebody who's maybe less spiritual, but much more literal in their understanding of what religion is or what their God is to them, it's what's written in the Bible. And, you know, if they're, you know, Christian, then Jesus is God, and that is an all-powerful, you know, all-knowing, omnipotent being. I can't wrap my head around that personally. Of any God, of any omnipotent being. It's more so like our minds just can't understand or comprehend this power, this thing beyond us. But I don't believe it's a being of some sort that has omnipotent power. Just our brains just can't wrap no more than, like I've said, like a non-sentient being can question their own existence. Their brain just cannot wrap their head around those concepts. So same thing for me in religion. It's the idea is that it's such a, like you said earlier, so many people can define it in so many different ways. that it's hard to draw as to what it is in the first place, in my opinion. Of course, you have your traditional sense of what that meaning is, but that's not what mine is.
That's deep. I mean, there's one kind of saying I'm kind of drawn to. Religion is man's search for God, and Christianity is God's search for man. And I mean, you're absolutely right that God is beyond being, beyond anything we can comprehend.
There's a book called *Sapiens* by Yuval Harari, I think.
Sure.
And a big part of his argument in his book is that the reason why humans have been able to create large populations that get along beyond nationalism, at least back, especially during the Crusades and stuff like that, was because of religion. And so religion is this man-made, he calls them stories. These stories that we create in order that we can all choose to believe in, so that we can create these larger hierarchical structures. Like before, when you have smaller tribal systems, and that's one of the reasons he argued for the reason why Homo sapiens were able to basically genocidally eradicate all the other warring species, was because we were able to grow larger in numbers than other races, the Cro-Magnons, for example, and it was one who are actually smarter than humans on paper, but the idea is they couldn't create these elaborate stories together. The creative stories of, this is a powerful being, this is what unites us, and you can create large populations of much larger than just a small tribe, but large populations together. So religion, he argues, is the reason for that.
Yeah. So, I'm very sympathetic to. I think a lot of times atheists are really turned off by the use of religion by politicians and political life.
I'm with you on that.
I'm sympathetic to that. And that's part of the book, part of my critique, right? Because when you have this modern idea of sovereignty, what you have is a state that is responsible for religious truth, that is controlling religion. So what happened was, Martin Luther is excommunicated in 1521. 3 years later, there's the German Peasants' War, where now we're printing up Bibles and everyone can read it for themselves. Priesthood of all believers were breaking from the church, and they start having a revolution. It was the biggest thing until the French Revolution, earthquake in its era, shaking the whole social structure. And there was a fierce reaction to it, and there were all of these peasants that were massacred. And Luther supported that, and then really moved into the camp of the princes, right? And his view is, it's the creation of religion. It's creation of our idea of religion. Of religion is you and your own beliefs, reading the Bible as an individual, not so much a church. There is no real authority in a church. All the authority is with the prince. Okay, well, what happens when these different sects disagree, and you've got some crazy sects saying we should have a revolution, we have communism. Well, then it's up to the prince to determine religious truth. So this modern concentration of authority in the sovereign then leads to this scenario where then the prince is using religion for nationalistic purposes.
Right.
And so really the preeminent modern political idea is the divine right of kings. Right. And that did not work out so well because people didn't like that in theory. It didn't work out so well in practice with the Stuarts. Back to this idea of, the God beyond all our comprehension, though. And like I say, it really matters how we're viewing God. Are we viewing religion as this is the way to unite an entire people? Well, you do that by sacrificing a scapegoat and then divinizing that scapegoat. That's how that works in archaic societies.
Do you need a scapegoat in order for people to be united under religion? Is that?
Well, the cause of violence and war and dissension is within the human heart. So if you have a faith that is attacking that,
Sure,
that is trying to work on the human heart, and also trying to say in external political life, we're not sacrificing scapegoats, that is something really different from archaic religion. So that is why, if you look to the Bible, Abraham sacrificing Isaac, right? The whole point is we don't do child sacrifice. This is the God that does not do child sacrifice. The kings of Israel and Judah always falling away. Why? Because they were adopting the archaic religion of the peoples around them, and they were setting up the high places. What are the high places? It's where they were sacrificing children. So this is the constant battle of how we're different from other people. How are we going to combine?
Yeah.
We're going to sacrifice the innocent third party.
Right.
So it's something very different.
So archaically, sacrifices would be made in order to unite people? Is that what you're saying?
Right. So the gods are demanding this sacrifice.
Right. And human sacrifice has always been done, in one way, shape, or form to appease the gods.
Because you're trying to unite the whole society. What could you sacrifice?
I see. So people who had questions about the religion that they were all a part of, if there was some sort of warring things, the one thing that they could agree on is, let's make the gods happy, let's appease these gods, and let's make the sacrifice, and that would bring us together.
Well, the whole society, and we're such individualists, we think ourselves as these autonomous individuals, but we're part of society, right? And you really sense that when you're, in a tribe that's fighting for its existence. Like, you are in this together, and the family and the tribe has given you everything. So what can you give back? What sacrifice is going to measure up to that? Well, God's demanding child sacrifice seems to make sense. And we do the same thing. We do the same thing, right? We have in our country, this is the function, I would say, of this language of morality, this language of values, right? You could say, okay, this violence is immoral, right? What these people are doing is immoral. You might as well say this is not approved of by the gods. And you just look at our history over the past couple decades. We've fought a lot of wars. We got hurt in 9/11. We launched a war that was called a crusade. We spent a bunch of money. There was lots of life lost. And it's not often talked about, but we tortured a lot of people. We set up torture sites around the whole world, and we tortured a lot of people at these black sites.
Right.
And torture and the sacred, it's these connected things. What do we have to sacrifice? And the people who are doing this aren't doing it for fun. They're doing it out of these patriotic reasons. For the whole of society, we've got to protect the whole of society. There are these threats that are trying to eliminate us, and we have to do everything we can to make sure that we are protected as a united country. And that leads to these things. This leads to these sacrificial moments.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know if there's any way to fix that. I don't think I don't know, unless there's some sort of human way that we evolve, like our brains evolve past that. I don't know if there's any way that flaw in humanity can ever change. I don't know if there is.
Well, that's the promise in the Bible. That's the promise in the Bible, is that you don't have to be like the other peoples. You don't have to be doing child sacrifice. It requires this faith. It requires this trust. Now, what's the difference between a biblical religion and what we've been talking about with this modern creation of our current concept of religion, what individuals choose, and this that's connected, I would say, to this archaic concept, which is these forces that rule our lives and require sacrifice. I lost my train of thought. What was I saying?
How do you reconcile the religion as it was today with the Bible as it was written, essentially?
Yeah, it was such a great point. You're going to have to edit this out.
It's all right, no worries. No worries. It'll come back to you.
It will.
It'll come back to you.
Yeah.
So religion in that sense is like we still use religion today. Like the idea is our values.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Thanks. So it seems to me that the Bible is talking about not faith in a worldview or a doctrine,
right?
Or trying to unite a whole people by sacrificing scapegoats. Rather, it's the relationship.
Right.
So it's about a relationship with God.
Right.
And that requires faith, that requires trust. So the ancient Israelites are saying, look, to survive, we kind of have to enculturate ourselves with the people around us. Right? What's the alternative? Well, you're believing in what the prophets are telling you to do, even though in a geopolitical sense it seems crazy. Let's make an alliance. Let's incorporate these other gods.
Well, I think you're adding this, and this is my issues with it is the 10 Commandments on paper are great. I think you're adding a lot of extra baggage, by adding parts or elements of the Bible that aren't there to necessarily help create a better society or a better person or a more caring person. I think if we could all agree, like say, nobody wants to kill anybody else. You shall, don't have sex with the neighbor's wife. These basic 10 commandments. If we can, those are a great starting point for us to be able to live our life by. And I think those are one of the main reasons why religion, Judaic religions have been able to flourish and last for so long, because they have these basic good, I would argue, ideas and ideals that, there's no other system or hierarchy of system that has created something like this on such a large scale. And that's how religion is why we are where we are today, for better or for worse. The question is what's the next step? Like, where do we go from here, from there? Like, how do we take all the bad out and keep all the good without religion? Even the family institution, which, the idea of a strong family unit, which I believe has kind of waned in the last 20 or 30 years, the idea of the strength of family and the importance of family. And I used to not have this viewpoint of family because I never thought about it much until I had kids. Mm-hmm. But, at the end of the day, who teaches kindness and respect to others? Largely, it's the parents, right? That's their job to do. And so it's this vicious cycle that can be perpetuated through generations if it's not taught in the family. So I guess without religion, how else do you have these values that you can instill in your children? I'm happy instilling them in my children in a secular standpoint. We do Shabbat ceremonies. We go to my wife's Catholic, so we also go to church. So we're exposing our children to religion, to, I guess you would say, the traditions of religion, and we let them we'll let them believe whatever they want to believe in that sense. But how do you instill these values on a large scale without something like religion?
Yeah, boy, yeah, those are great points. So I would say it's just not enough. It's just not enough to have certain principles, to have a conception of morality, to have these things you're going to say are values. What is the point of them? So that was one of the driving questions of writing my book is, what is the point of this? Like, why try to be moral at all? If ultimately being moral is just one person's opinion. Sure, they say that it's good if I follow these precepts. But what am I getting out of it? Well, I'm getting their good opinion of me. So is that what I'm getting out of it? Is just that other people will think well of me?
Well, also because it's reciprocity. I think the idea of not wanting to be treat somebody how nobody would want to be treated the way that you would treat somebody else, or in a bad way. So, the idea is, if I don't want you to treat me this way, then I shouldn't be treating anybody this way. That's the idea. So I think
it's for the sake of relationships. So like Aristotle's saying, the point of virtue, the point of self-control, the hard work of governing myself, is not just for its own sake, so then other people will think well of me. No, it's actually for the sake of friendship with these other people. Right? The 10 Commandments aren't something that you can pluck out of their context and say, okay, it's this natural law. No, it's a gift. It was given to a particular people that have a particular purpose, and that purpose is friendship with God. And is it a friendship that is exclusive and is going to sacrifice third parties, or is it acting as a friend in trustworthy ways that can also comprehend other people, that can also overflow into friendship with others? So that's I think how to view what you're describing, and the language I would want to use to express that. It's not inculcating principles and worldviews and beliefs, but it is actually having real relationships with others, with your family, with your children, that are going to be good, strong relationships where loyalty is shown, trust is shown, friendship is shown, but that also don't require bashing someone else. Don't require we've all been in those social situations where we want to get along and somebody's being criticized, some political position or party, and we kind of join in the bashing. Right? That's showing a lack of loyalty. The highest levels of loyalty is when we can disagree. And all science is based on this, right? Western science is based on this strong loyalty relationships where we can fiercely disagree about something. And in that disagreement, these different points of view can do what? Can then be shaped into a comprehensive whole that is not a partial truth, but is getting to the full truth.
That's well said. And I think in order for us to be able to argue, to agree to disagree, there are certain rights that we must be afforded to be able to do that. Mainly freedom of speech, being able to say what you want to say without feeling or worrying that what you say is going to have repercussions to a certain extent, right? There are limits to that. But in order to just express yourself without feeling like you're being you need to be quelled, to be quieted. And I feel like discourse, not only do people not want to have as much discourse today, but anybody who has an opposing view of what the mainstream opinion should be, I feel, is silenced, regardless of how kooky that they may seem, whether people call them a conspiracy theorist or for whatever their points are. The idea is we should be able to say what we want to say without being silenced in any way, shape, or form in order to have these free-flowing exchanges of ideas. Not trying to get controversial here, but this was done. There were a lot of controversial minds during COVID. Scientists who were well respected, Robert Malone, who was one of the inventors of the mRNA technology, but he was shunned or ostracized by a lot of the scientific community at the time, maybe because of the media, maybe not. I don't know what the reasons for it is, but I know that he was a respected person in that community. But because he was questioning these ideas of whether or not the efficacy of the vaccine, for example, because he was questioning things, he was essentially ostracized and quelled from any type of mainstream media, for example. Nobody would know mainstream media. To mainstream media, he was a joke, but he was a respected person in the scientific community. So I think it's hard to have a conversation with somebody if you're just dismissed as, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, you're crazy, versus let's hear you out. Let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, boy. Yeah. So you hit on it. The internet era is the dawn of a new age. The book I'd really recommend reading is Martin Gurry's Revolt of the Public. And it's just such a different phenomenon now. I was watching a a press conference on Twitter, and there's all these comments that are being posted while the politician's doing the press conference. That is something really different than a scenario we've had before, which is kind of unidirectional, right? You watch the performance on TV, but there's not so much coming back.
Instant feedback, yeah.
With the rise of the internet, the public figures, the news media figures can put something out there and then people can comment on it. And there's all of these alternative methods to broadcast out news, scientific results, opinions. And Martin Gurry's point is this is really stressing institutions because people are losing faith in the institutions.
Because there's so many ways to get get the word out, right? Because there's everybody can I can have a conversation, broadcast it on YouTube right away, right? Everybody can have a voice, and it's hard to. There's so much clutter out there, and is that what you mean?
Oh yeah, that's what he means. And when he gives a talk in Silicon Valley, it's packed to the rafters and tons of questions. And when he gives a talk in Washington D.C., it's not even half full, and there's crickets. So we are in an era right now of shifting between these two eras in human history.
So you're talking about, he's talking about media specifically, right? Essentially how news and media is broadcast, essentially.
Right. And the effect that it has, this torrent of information we now have access to, the impact that has on our institutions and the trust we have in our institutions. So it was much easier to kind of have a national conversation when it's not a 24 hours news cycle, and then cable news came and that happened.
Right.
And it's not this kind of instantaneous, continual torrent of news that we have now. So the natural censorship is no longer there. The natural control of the narrative that the leaders of the institutions had is no longer there. So we are trying to figure out how to deal with that. And it is going to take generations before we deal with that. I mean, it's similar to the Martin Luther's era.
Right.
Because you have
with the printing
press and cheap paper and these flame wars. I mean, you read Martin Luther's stuff, it's amazing. I mean, he would have been great on Twitter. Right. He's slinging back and forth. But then what do you have? I mean, you have, the Protestant Reformation, rise of the modern state, 30 Years' War. Like, it took a while to iron out what that new reality was going to be. So we are on the cusp of seeing something potentially very different, I think, because of this. Because the old notions, like you're saying, freedom of speech, every viewpoint respected, those are just coming under such strain.
With the governing
because
force.
What is the narrative going to be? Who are we listening to, and what are we following? And it's no longer these kind of official channels.
Right. And just to be clear on what the word narrative is, because I think people may have a misconception of the word itself, is I think there has always been some sort of general message from the governing body. That message being imparted to its people. And now that everybody can have a seeming voice. Back then when nobody, cameras were expensive. Not anybody could broadcast on television, right? So you had a main message that was brought to you by the government, and everybody could get in line with that because everybody was getting the same information. Now that there's this giant flux of information, and everybody can have their own thoughts and can create smaller, quite large groups and broadcast it out for the world to see. People are starting to get different ideas of what messages are. They're starting to see more corruption than I don't think there's more corruption today in, say, American politics than there probably ever was. But I think we're just more exposed to it because there's more information, there's more people talking about it, and it can be broadcast large as a whole. So the narrative in that sense is that the narrative is I think the narrative is to protect the governing body. And I think it may have always been that. That is that's its intent. And so I think when people start to realize that we aren't happy with what the narrative is, things must change for it to be better. And I think that the ideas of the founding fathers of America, those ideals I think are still great ideals. And I think that that's probably what's been. I think those ideas have been compromised to a certain extent. The amendments that the Anti-Federalists fought for to get, and I'm glad they did. The question is where it's going to shape. I know that there's been some, for example, Google has recently has been censoring all independent news networks from their search engine. Right, that happened a couple weeks ago. What is an independent news source? What is an independent journalist? Does that mean you don't have a team? That means you don't have as much money? What does that mean, independent? Because, freedom of press is freedom of press. You don't have to be like NBC. You don't have to be ABC. You don't have to have millions of dollars to be a journalist, right? So the question is what is an independent journalist? It's my question. And why would that be done?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
The idea that they're a private company, they can do what they want, but the idea that they would try to combat what they consider as disinformation by removing certain voices that have an opinion on a topic that's political is beyond me. Who gets to decide what truth is? Who decides what truth is? There is truth to a certain extent, like this, my hand is, or that guitar is red behind you, to a certain extent. But it should not stop the conversation from happening as to if someone disagrees with me on that or not.
Well, so, this is causing us to lose trust in our institutions, though.
True. That is the effect. So,
I think it was extremely well put how you're viewing the situation. Corruption has always been there, but now when you're suddenly shining a light on it and saying, aha, and pointing everybody's attention to it,
right.
What is the effect that has?
Right. It builds distrust and
so,
it can top.
So,
yeah, it can hurt.
It's great to be at a university. I love, discussions about truth and trying to advance our knowledge of the truth. Political discourse is not an academic discussion of faculty members trying to find the truth. It's winning over people's loyalties and trust. So, the independent journalists that are exposing things that go against the narrative, exactly like you said, the result of that is people are less trusting and ultimately less loyal to those institutions. So,
is that such a bad thing?
Well, that's a really good question. The goal of politics is loyalty, trust, friendship, voluntary compliance. When we trust,
that's an interesting word,
each other, when we trust our institutions, when they act as sacrifice of us, when they tax us, conscript our children, willingly going along with these things is a great good. That propensity to compliance is a great good. And it's very tough to be in charge when you don't have that ability to censor just kind of naturally
but why would
the content of the decision making.
Right, yeah.
So, so you talked about the principles of the founding. So, the founding was this group of elites meeting behind closed doors to hash out the fate of this huge continent. The anti-federalists were not happy about this. Patrick Henry heard about it and he said he smelt a rat, right? Like, would that even be today something we would ever conceive of? We have, as we're recording this, the House of Representatives hasn't picked a speaker. They have these closed door meetings. Stuff always leaks out. But I saw the prominent journalist say, well, there shouldn't be closed door meetings. Yes, there should. Yes, there should. You've got to, not everything can be broadcast. I mean, we had a serious problem, I think, when C-SPAN started broadcasting the floor of the House and Senate and committee meetings, because now the audience is not each other, the fellow representatives trying to come together, compromise, make policy, but now the audience is the TV audience. And you can gain in prestige and power and financially as a politician if you're playing to that audience. And that's what happened. Newt Gingrich figured this out. He started making a lot of special order speeches to play to the C-SPAN audience. You might think they're small and insignificant, have nothing better to do. But he became this known commodity and rode that to become Speaker of the House, and then changed the nature of the way Congress worked to being very leader-focused and ideologically focused. So, I mean, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention wanted to censor what was going on. Madison did not release his notes until way, way later. It caused a scandal when it did release the notes of the convention. So we want our leaders to compromise. We want our leaders to make good decisions and consider the whole. I don't know how you can consider the whole without talking to the representatives of the other areas of the whole and sharing information and then, okay, let's do a compromise.
Right.
But that has to be behind closed doors,
right,
seem to me, if you want people to be honest.
Right.
And, that's not our political tradition. I mean, certainly the convention, the Constitution is this great achievement. We have a lot to be proud of in this country with our political traditions and institutions and local government and state government. It's amazing the achievement of something people didn't think could exist, democratic government. They thought it would fail. You have to have a monarch, right? But our political tradition. So what I'm doing in my book is I'm saying, look, the way we're talking about politics, the words we're using, the concepts we're using, don't correspond to this reality. The reality is politicians looking at where people's loyalties lie. I'm co-teaching a class with a former congressman who also has a Ph.D. in political science, and he told the students, don't run for office if you're a political scientist. And they said, well, why? And he said, because it doesn't teach you anything about actual politics.
Right. And that was the whole purpose. A big part of this conversation is the definition of politics is, like I said earlier, depending on who you ask, is two very different meanings, right? And to a politician who wants to gain power, it's a very different type of dynamic.
It's loyalties.
Yeah.
Who are people following and groups of people following? And that's the substance of it. And our language doesn't reflect that well enough. And our political tradition, we were steeped in this country Whig opposition ideology from Britain. We ate this up. I mean, this was the intellectual basis for the revolution. But it is these folks in opposition. Again, it was like a Twitter war. They were just writing these very hostile, violent things about the government. So they weren't in charge of running anything. People who wrote Cato's letters, Bolingbroke. They're in opposition
to the crown.
To what was being done by Robert Walpole and the German monarchs, the Georges in England. They were opposing that. They were saying that's corrupt. They wanted this to be opened up. They wanted manhood suffrage. So that's where that's always our inclinations. Well, things would be better if just everyone could vote and the process is opened up and there's sunlight in and everybody could have freedom of speech. But the more it's almost like the more we do that, the more alienated we feel.
Well, I agree, but I think it's a transitionary period. I think, like you said, with talking about Luther earlier, I think this is a transitionary period because now that Americans are aware of the corruption that's going on, they're aware that the idea of government, of what the government should be based on the founding fathers' perspective, what a government should be, is not what it is today. The government is extremely convoluted. The executive branch has, it's a sense of nationalism has gone because of this, right? People aren't, and I don't know. There could be other factors. The decline of the family, I think, is a big part of it as well. But I think the sense of nationalism, pride for your country, is not where it is today, where it was 30 years ago, where it was 40 years ago, especially after 9/11. And so I think that first of all, for Americans to be proud of their country, we need to have leaders who we believe have our best interest in mind and not their own. And I think that's a big part of what the distrust is in government as it is today. And I think that's a big part of what the discourse is. And I think that a lot of things can be changed. I think, as a good example, just George Washington setting a term limit on his own leadership role as president, and if that's right, and the fact that we have career politicians who are serving in politics, who have been serving in politics their entire life, does not make sense to me. I think serving for your government should be a small, finite term, just like the presidency, and you move on. The idea of a career politician, to me, doesn't make sense.
Okay, that's great. So, I mean, this is right out of our American political tradition, right out of our country rig opposition ideology language. What is the solution that Bolingbroke would give to this corruption of Robert Walpole bribing members of the House of Commons? They'd go to his office and receive sacks of gold.
Right, and that's still going on today, right?
Them off, and it's still going on today
in different forms.
Yeah, that's right. So, his solution is the Patriot King. Well, if only we had a king who put the interests of the whole country, right? So, not the interest of the court, Washington, D.C., the swamp, because the court, but the whole country. So it's country Whig opposition ideology. Well, it's not that simple because, listen to what the solution is that naturally comes to our minds and comes to our lips. Well, if only these leaders prioritized the whole country over themselves. Again, that's too unidirectional. Like, where are we in this? Are we just sitting back? Television, we kind of sit back and we watch it happen, and the leaders are doing things, and it kind of doesn't involve us.
Right. But it could involve
no,
you.
it most certainly, yeah. Well, we are empowered. It's response that's the kingmaker. The leaders can do their thing. And when you actually think about these folks in Congress, in the White House, if you put yourself in their shoes, what kind of power do they have? There's this quote from this one congressman. He said, "My first term in Congress, I wanted to save the world. After a few terms, I just wanted to save the United States. After a few more terms, I just wanted to save this one fishery on Lake Michigan."
Right.
It's just, what power do they have? Really, what does Congress do? They can pass laws. What does the president do? Make one or two big decisions in a 4-year term. Really, it's us. We are controlling our destiny. We are controlling whether, we want patriotism to be increased or not, by committing ourselves to noble purposes or not. We are a generous people, a welcoming people. There are lots to be proud of. We can do a lot on local levels and make a huge impact. And that is real.
No, I agree.
Whereas the Twitter wars are kind of not real.
No, I agree. I think that starting with your community and how you can contribute to your small community is the best thing that you can do to live a happy life. And I know that you're right. The internet is not real, and we create these giant stories about, people like log on and they'll spend hours just commenting and creating this and living in this fake world. And then you step outside, you're like in your community and you're like, oh, wow, let me just go help out at the church. Let me go help at the shelter,
right.
Be involved in my community, go coach the soccer game, the soccer team that I did this morning. That's the idea. That's tangible. Yeah. That's real. I think though that there are certain, just from a pragmatic standpoint, there are certain laws and corruptions that could easily change today in politics to help ameliorate the corruption and problems that a lot of Americans have with the government. I think humans are naturally greedy. We're naturally power hungry, your average person. And if there are ways to manipulate the system in order to advantage you, whether it's for power, whether it's for wealth, you will take it. And I think perfect example is, lobbying, private interests. Those are things that have no business being in government, in my opinion. There should be no the fact that the amount of money that for the pharma that Pfizer is getting from the government, for example, subsidies, for example, and I understand that there's a fine line between what's good, because on paper, and a lot of these are good ideas on paper, but they are taken advantage of, right? School loan subsidies, as an example, people are going to take advantage of it. Schools are going to raise their tuitions because they can get help, money from the government. The welfare, PPP loans, when there was lockdown, if there's a way to get money or take advantage of the system one way or another, people are going to take that advantage. And I think that certain things can be relegated in order to help prevent that. Yeah. I just don't know how.
Yeah, no, you're asking really good questions, because I would say one of the best books you could read on Congress is called Demosclerosis by Jonathan Rauch. It's back in the 90s, but boy, he really saw the issue of the way that Americans are almost represented too well. Like, we really have professionalized this idea of democratic representation through lobbyists. I mean, they're experts, they're professionals, they do their job very well. And it's creating this issue. I mean, it's coming to head, obviously, in the news over the past month. We're spending $7 trillion and only taking in $5 trillion. That's a big problem. That's a big problem.
Yeah.
And how do we navigate that, live within our means, not enslave future generations to all they'll be doing is paying off interest payments on the national debt. Not to mention the entitlement programs. I mean, the entitlement programs are not going to be there for younger generations, probably not going to be there for you and me. That is going to lead to a real loss of trust.
Like Medicare or Medicaid?
Yeah, so I mean, Social Security,
yeah.
It's going to go bankrupt. There's things we could do to solve this.
What would that be?
Well, make hard choices. I mean, there's differences of opinion on how you do this. At the moment, as we're recording this, the argument is over this process, over how Congress works, and not having real deliberation over this. They tried to create this budget process in the 70s. It kind of worked, and then it broke down, and it's been in total breakdown. They don't pass the budget. They don't pass the appropriations bills. They're not really scrutinizing what's going into it. So I had a colleague who did government affairs at my institution say, boy, you get a line in that defense bill, that's forever. That will never go away. Like that, right. There are teams of people who are lobbyists who are just trying to get that line, and then it never goes away. Now, is the solution just to get more patriotic congressmen and women who are putting the national interest over the interest of the lobbyists? that's the way we think. That's the way we speak. That's our political tradition. But we are on the cusp of having to kind of consider what kind of radical solutions are coming down the pike, because there's been such a loss of trust in these institutions. And when it kind of hits the fan with accepting that we're bankrupt, which I've kind of been saying after the financial crisis,
right.
We're still trying to have American empire. How do you do that post-financial crisis? While we've been trying to do it, just racking up the national debt.
Yeah.
But at some point, you're going to be paying so much in interest payments, it just overwhelms everything else. The clock is now really ticking on that. And that will be real loss of trust. So what do you do in that kind of scenario?
Or how do you combat that? Like, why is it so hard to balance a budget? I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a lot of money and there's lots of plays involved, but the point is let's just, if you have, we can't create money, right? So how do we, I mean, you can, but how do we fix that? How do you say stop spending more money than you have?
Well, but there are enormous teams of professional representatives, lobbyists, who will have very good reasons why you can't cut this little thing, and will marshal the support and get everybody on board and defeat the amendment to whatever you're trying to do. Now, flip that around, though. This is how democracy works. I mean, it's an open system, and that means you can petition your representatives in the Third Amendment, and you can professionalize that if you want to. This is what we've done. So, yeah, demosclerosis. We're hemmed in because every which way Congress turns, there's this entrenched vested interest that has a really good argument that you were going to hurt these people
if you don't give us money.
And the entitlement programs are the biggest one. It's called the third rail of American politics because you touch it, you get electrocuted. I mean, in the last State of the Union address, the Republicans stood up and were yelling, "You liar, you liar." What was getting them so upset at President Joe Biden that they would shout, "You liar," in the middle of the State of the Union? He said Republicans want to cut Social Security and Medicare. So it's Republicans
it's a scapegoat.
Being vehemently, how dare you suggest, because they know how potent of an issue that is.
Right.
You've got people relying on that. You can't cut that, and you would be killed in the next election if you had to cut that.
Right.
So that's where they're really, it's hemmed in, and it's difficult to kind of do the obvious thing.
Prioritize.
Where you're saying, well, I don't like these professional politicians. We should get people who are able to do this, care about the country. Well, that was the idea of the Constitution too. The idea of the Constitution was, again, country Whig opposition ideology. We don't like parties. We don't like these corrupt professional politicians. We are going to get the right type of people. The people we know are the merchants and the people who know how the economy works and can make this government work. And then to their horror, right away what started happening is professional politicians started getting elected, and they started beating the people that they thought should be in office, the elites, the Robert Morrises, the James Wilsons, and they started running campaigns. Like, that's beneath a gentleman. A gentleman doesn't go ask for someone's vote. Everyone just knows they're better and they vote for them automatically. That was their thinking. That went away very quickly. And suddenly we became this class of professional politicians. However, you need that to make democracy work. And it's the same with lobbyists, right? One man's vital program is another man's special interest. So,
right.
So I mean, that's to set up the conundrum we're faced with. So how do we? I mean, we're on the cusp where there's probably going to be big changes coming soon, and we're going to be forced to, whether we like it or not, kind of reevaluate our system. So, I mean, I have a proposal for you. I'd be interested to see what you think.
Please help. Please help us.
So, in the Constitutional Convention, George Washington presided, and he didn't speak on any topic until the very end. At the very end, there was one item. It was actually right before they were going to all sign the Constitution. He said, you know what? I want this changed. What was the thing that he wanted changed? It was the size of districts in the House of Representatives from a minimum of 50,000 to a minimum of 30,000 inhabitants. Well, now we are up to over 700,000 people in a congressional district. They're gigantic. Wow. The only way you can run and be elected is through very expensive television advertisements. Yeah. It's very hard to go door to door. It's very hard to, get elected if you aren't backed financially by people who can bankroll you. It was artificially capped after the 1910 census. So we've got the current 435 members of the House, but there's a political science literature on how overwhelmed Congress is. I mean, they're exhausting themselves, and there's way too many things to do, and they're supposed to oversee the entire government, and they just can't do that. But this is the elected branch, right? We're much better off with leaders we elect than the unelected bureaucrats and the life-term judges. Sure. Just in terms of this loyalty, trust, and friendship, for sure. Right?
Yeah.
That's what Congress can do. As much as we bash Congress, they generate trust in the system because there's discussion, there's a fair fight. Okay, I didn't get what I wanted, but I trust that I know my representative and I trust what they're telling me.
But there are still no term limits for them as well, though. So there is still that chance of, them becoming these lifelong politicians, as you said.
But again, if you see the job of Congress is generating trust, you have to get in there and understand how the institution works and learn your way around, and get to know the other members of Congress and get to know the issues. It doesn't happen in a day. Term limits would then hand everything over to lobbyists. They're the professionals. The lobbyists and the media folks are always there. They never lose an election. They're there for life. And the lobbyists, control information. The congressional staff was cut after Newt Gingrich took over. They don't have enough staff. They can't retain staff because the pay for members of Congress is so low, and you can't pay the staffers more than the member of Congress. So people come in staffers only for 2.5 years and then leave. And you can imagine constant churn, revolving door of staff. I mean, that's a horrible situation.
Yeah.
These are the people that are supposed to be the watchdogs, and we eviscerate them. Well, who's going to win? Well, we see who wins. The lobbyists and the special interests. So then do everything with some gigantic bill run through at the last minute. Everybody gets the goodies that they want. And it's not their problem that future generations are indebted. They have a job to do, and they're doing it very well, which is representing the people who paid them to get their thing in the bill. So that's kind of an idea that has been floated by different people. I find very interesting. What if we increased the size of the House? And the original idea of George Washington, if you go down to 30,000 per district, you got now over 9,000 members of the House. Now, would that be too crazy, too cacophonous, ungovernable? Well, actually, the House is more governable than the Senate precisely because it is bigger. So they have to have more rules. The leaders have to be in control.
Right.
And it would be very hard, I think, for lobbyists to, if you're talking about thousands of representatives, kind of deal with that scenario. So it's kind of something intriguing to think about. But I think we are going to be on the cusp of having to think through potentially major changes in the way we're operating.
Yeah, I mean, there's just, and it's hard to decide how to prioritize these expenses as well. There's, at the end of the day, what is the federal government's, in your opinion, what is the federal government's role in America? What is their job? And maybe list the most important, obviously, and what should it be limited to?
Yeah, sure. So so that was the fierce debate at the convention, is how are we we're going to create this government, what is it going to be? And they decided, because of Roger Sherman and others, to have this limited government with defined powers. So Congress can do Article 1, Section 8, but then the states were the locus of everybody's energy and domestic policy. The idea was, well, we need to make treaties with other nations. We do need some national strength when it comes to kicking the British out, right?
So a military,
foreign
right?
Policy,
Definitely a military.
Strong military, protect us. But it was this idea of it had this more limited role. Now, at the convention, that was not James Madison's idea. James Madison wanted a block grant of power to the federal government because the situation they were faced with was too much democracy. The states were running amok. They felt like, again, they had these people off the streets basically getting elected, passing all these laws, and they were feeling uncomfortable. Like, there's going to be agrarian legislation. There's going to be redistribution legislation. They're going to destroy the basis of the economy by taking property away from the property classes. That's what they were afraid of. So it was more than just, even with Madison at the convention, it was more than just, we're just going to have this very limited government. They wanted to put a stop to runaway democracy in the states. Madison wanted a veto on state laws. He didn't get it. But then when the Constitution is put in force and you have the first administration with Washington, Alexander Hamilton takes this idea and runs with it. Of basically, we are going to do what Robert Walpole did that the country Whigs did not like. We're going to create this fiscal military state. We are going to have the federal government having a national bank and paying off state debts. And we're going to create a national debt to put all of the elites on the side of the federal government. And we're going to kind of suck the attention and power to the center.
Was that a mistake from the very beginning, from the get-go?
Well, that was highly controversial because that was creating exactly what the country Whigs did not want to create. And so there's fierce opposition. Right. With Madison and Jefferson, they created the first mass political party in human history, the Republican Democratic Party. And so those tensions were there from the very beginning. What is the role of the national government? It was a hands-off role. I mean, you have these presidents, unless you've memorized all the presidents in grade school, you don't know their names, right? From the 19th century, you don't know what they did. They didn't do that much. They were an administrator-in-chief. They were selected by parties because they had good moral character and were good symbol. But they were just there to kind of ratify what Congress wanted and make sure the administration, and there wasn't much of one, make sure the administration would run. Now that changed with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Great Depression. Right. But even before that with the progressives, who really wanted government to do more. Why? Well, the situation they're faced with is these corporations running amok, right? Corporate power, right, and trusts amassing all of this power and buying off politicians. They're saying, well, that's corrupt. We want to get back to virtuous patriotism. It's kind of the same language we've been using, certainly in this American political.
But couldn't it come down to the states to make these laws that were, say, where these private companies were overstepping their bounds?
Well, you've got Standard Oil completely owning the state legislature. I mean, they're just passing bill after bill after bill of what the corporations want. The corporations are dominant,
right?
And you have political parties that have power in the urban machines. Progressives thought that was corrupt. But there's a logic there. I mean, the current senator from Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, is the son of a very popular governor of Pennsylvania, Bob Casey Sr. And in his book, Bob Casey Sr. talks about his father, Adolphus Casey, who grew up in this time, turn of the century, worked in the anthracite coal mines northeastern Pennsylvania. He was a child laborer, right? And his job was to take the reins of the mules when they kind of kicked it off and put it back on. One day he gets kicked in the face by his mules. It's a dangerous job. The kids had to do it. He gets kicked in the face, thrown over this 5-foot cart, hits the wall of the mine, has this gash from his forehead down to his chin. And they just sent him home with another boy, right? I mean, the progressives were onto something as far as something's got to change here. We've got to stop child labor
law. Yeah.
We've got to have a safety net for people. The corporations can't just run our government for their own interests. But now there has to be. But
I feel like private government has got its way or its hand in the federal government now. So it's almost like the very thing that was there to stop these corporations is now being beholden to these corporations.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah, the pendulum swinging, right? These regulatory bodies that were started with this noble purpose of we are going to, in the public interest, stop corporate power, then become captured.
Yeah.
Right. If there's anything we know in the literature, it's regulatory capture. The regulators then come and work for you, serve on your board, are rewarded, so they know they want to do the bidding of the corporations. So we're facing kind of a similar problem, you could say, from over 100 years ago in the progressive era.
Just the other way around. Yeah.
Demosclerosis and regulatory capture. No, it is. These are big issues. They're national issues. So it's one thing to say, oh, well, turn to local government. But it's another thing to say, well, we have some problems as a country too. And we're gonna have to figure out how to solve these. And we can, that's the thing. If we wanted to address these and solve these, we really could iron out solutions where we wouldn't go bankrupt. We could keep the programs we wanted.
So what would you do? I know this is a very hard question to answer because it's very all encompassing, but what do you think would be the best things to do in order to keep the programs that you think are important, and you can tell us what those are, but also how do we fix such a convoluted kind of bureaucratic system as it's set up right now in the federal government?
Oh boy. Yeah. Well,
or maybe your top five, five things that you think, could help make the biggest change.
Yeah. Well, there's the classic warning of Dwight Eisenhower about the military industrial complex, his speech right at the end of his presidency. It's interesting. You mentioned George Washington self-term limiting. He wanted to quit after one term. He hated the media. He hated the press. And he wanted to give a farewell address that was just bashing the press. And Alexander Hamilton convinced him not to. So how much has changed? Right. There's never any golden age of the press. But yeah, Dwight Eisenhower saying, basically, we're this war machine. We've been fighting these endless conflicts. And that is not something, it seems to me, that leads to prosperity.
Right. As much as it'd be nice to, if you are trying to help your friend out, I'm just gonna be pragmatic. If you're trying to help your friend out and you have some wealth and they are down in the dumps and need financial help, then it makes sense to help them. But if you don't have money to help your friend, how can you give them money? I guess that's the idea. It's like if you have your own problems, if you're hungry for food, right? And I'm just paralleling this to the States, but if you're, quote, hungry for food and you're having a hard time getting food yourself, you can be as sharing and as giving as you want, but at the end of the day, you have to also look out for yourself. And I think the the role of America as being the, it's been known as the world police, or the, and spending exorbitant sums of money, over now 20 billion now in Ukraine. When there's lots of problems going on internally in the States that we could fix without having to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars in other countries.
Right.
It's like a fine line. It's like you do need to help out, but there's that sense also at the end of the day, America is a nation, nationalism, right? Like the idea of a country being able to have its own borders, to be able to have its own people, to be strong in itself before it can even go out and help other countries. So you're saying like limiting the amount of money that we spend or give to other countries, or just spend on the military in the first place, or what?
Yeah. So military spending, it seems to me.
And is that what you meant when you said the military complex, like the amount of money that we're spending?
The amount of money that we're spending on it. Right. So that the military budget just seems like this black hole.
Yeah, it's never ending.
And it's always the least controversial thing Congress does. I mean, insofar as demosclerosis, the lobbyists and special interests have honed this down to a science. It's support the troops. We have manufacturing in all of these districts of the country. Now, I mean, the NDAA actually became controversial for the first time just this year. I think we're going to see more and more of that, more and more.
What's the NDA?
Oh, just the National Defense Authorization Act.
Okay.
I mean, when people talk about Congress, they normally think of gridlock, but actually they pass a lot of things, bipartisan, uncontroversial. Most of what they do is like that. Certainly the defense is always like that, but starting to become more controversial.
How much they're spending, or what they're okaying, essentially, for the defense?
Yeah. So the Republicans were putting in some controversial elements into that Democrats were voting against this year when they did it. And I think there's going to be more focus on that. I mean, the idea from the 90s was the peace dividend. Okay, the Cold War is over. We don't have to be spending so much on the military. To justify the military, you have to have these wars. So it's this kind of vicious cycle.
It's like let's start a war to make money, right?
Yeah, and there's money to be made because you have to have the money to fight the war, and then you have to pay the people to rebuild the country after the war. So that's I think an area that we should focus on, and I think that will be focused on.
Yeah. Before you move on to the next one, but do you know what percentage of our entire budget is spent on the defense budget? What percentage do you know, roughly?
It always kind of varies year to year. It's a good percentage.
Yeah, and off the top of my head, I'm thinking
50%. It's less than 50%.
30 or something, somewhere between 30 and 50%, which is huge. But also because the federal government is such a large entity. It's bureaucratic, therefore it's not managed extremely well. And so when not only is it spending a lot of money, but I believe a lot of money is wasted, right? I've seen movies in this instance, like a movie called War Dogs, which is great. But these defense contracts that are given by people who are starting out their own companies to try to get contracts with the government, where they're charging way more than value, and the government's just writing out checks, and so because people see an opportunity, we're spending money on this defense, we're spending money in, we're sending money over to Ukraine, let's create a way to make money off of this, right? Yep. So limiting the amount of money or reducing that would be one, and I'll let you keep going.
And who's going to oversee that? I mean, that is the job of Congress. That is the job of Congress to oversee that. But with the large amounts of money and the vast, sprawling apparatus that is the executive branch bureaucracy you're supposed to be overseeing, they're just overwhelmed. Hence my pet idea of we enlarge the size of the House. We went back to Washington's idea there would be over 9,000 members of Congress. And more politicians...
if it was 30,000 per, yeah.
More politicians, that is that a bad thing? I mean, we again, our liberal tradition, we tend to denigrate politics. It's almost like a dirty word. Politicians like a dirty word.
You should see them as a representative.
But really,
right?
Yeah, they're the ones making government represent us. They're the ones linking us to our government. They're the ones who can help address this problem of the decline of trust. So to my mind, more of them would just be better. And then you would have this capacity. I mean, we already have 9,000 people on Capitol Hill. It's called congressmen and women and their staff, right? So we could just do away with the staff and just basically elect all the staff. They would be doing the things they're doing, but they would be elected. And you're elected by your I mean, if 30,000 people is a small little amount of people. It would be your reputation that people would be voting for you, potentially. Now, I don't know how that would, with our intense kind of partisanship, I don't know how that would interact. But yeah, so certainly defense spending, the enormous amounts we've spent on wars in the last 20 years, 8 trillion or whatever it is kind of the first thing to think about.
Yeah.
I just throw out a couple interesting ones. If you do a focus group of American voters of any political stripe, different political parties, you'll all get them to agree that we should eliminate the carried interest provision of the tax code, which is what allows, executives of big corporations to not pay any taxes, right? Because they get $1 in salary, but then it's all the stock options. And so they make their money with a much lower tax rate than everybody else. Everybody thinks that should end, right? That's kind of a no-brainer. But if you're running a campaign for office, you'll get a call from your major contributor. They'll say, you know what? I really like what you're doing.
You should forget this idea.
I like your positions, and I want to support you, and you're free to go about your business. I just want to let you know one thing that's really near and dear to my heart. It's carried interest. I think that's just really important to have. And also taxing the PJs. Tax the PJs. We're concerned about global warming. The private jets. They've all got these private jets.
Right.
This is, again, something that would unite white
Do you think that make that much difference?
No. But it would be a way to raise a considerable amount of revenue quickly and help the environment.
Well, I think, like you said, it could help unite the middle class in that sense around something that's kind of social, because not your average Joe's never going to be riding on a private jet ever in his life, and it's like, what do you? Yeah, of course, tax it. So something that could help unite people on a social level.
So yeah, I mean, I think there are segments of the American society that are highly aware of these things, and sometimes I get the feeling that the divisive issues, the kind of culture war issues that have bubbled up over the last 5-10 years and have embroiled us, and we spend a lot of time arguing with each other. Again, like you say, this phenomenon of the internet is one thing, and then I walk outside of my house and I'm like, this is peaceful, get along with people. It's not really impacting like this, we're going to hell in a handbasket, but are we really?
Right.
So those divisions, I mean,
I guess it depends on what neighborhood you step out on, where you live and what neighborhood you step out into.
That's true.
So I do agree. I think that for a large section of the population, there's a good, there's a sense of community, but I think it depends on which community you're in. And I think that, somebody who's working 2 or 3 jobs to get by and lives in a crime-ridden town, they're going to have a much different viewpoint of what their idea of community is in the first place. So they may, they see that in their backyard, and then they see the divisiveness on social media, and they got nothing, to kind of run into. So I think I was a big Bernie fan back in the day, 2015, and I think he had a good message in that, and I think that that's something that's caused a lot of division, is that the majority of America is the middle class, and I think that's this section of society that's financially taken the biggest toll in the last 30 years, who's with cost of living going up. So don't get me wrong. I think everybody's way of life, and I think I was just talking about this with my brother-in-law last podcast, but 100 years ago, your average person's way of life was way worse than even your poorest person's way of life is today, right? But I think that opportunity, but again, I don't have much to go by just from what I've seen on the news and on social media. Opportunity seems like it's gotten a lot harder to accomplish something and have opportunities in America today as opposed to 20 or 30 years ago. I don't know if that's the case or not.
Yeah, it's a lot tougher. And certainly, the segment of society I'm involved with, higher education, those costs just have gone up and up and up.
Right.
Make it very difficult. Housing costs. So, getting educated for my parents' generation, way lower tuition costs, way lower housing costs. You could start a life, you could start a family,
right.
You could make your way, whereas it's much more burdensome now. And part of that is, the government
subsidizing school loans.
Subsidizing school loans and then regulating schools as well. I mean, it's not the instructional costs. There's a great book on this, Academically Adrift, that shows, it's not the professors that are making so much more money or there's so much more of them. That's remaining
right.
constant. It's all of the support staff and the accoutrements to the college experience. And part of that is, federal mandates. You have to hire more bureaucrats. You have to hire more people to implement that, and it drives the costs up. So,
do you think that in the college sense, the subsidized school loans have played a large role in that, though? I mean, the fact that tuition, a lot of times that tuition rates are set based on the funding that schools can get from them, and so that would be a huge thing in quelling that increase in price, because if the school doesn't use this money this year, they may not get the money the next year from the government. So let's keep raising our rates so that we can keep getting the money from the government, right? So it's just a question of how do you, again, these ideas where on paper, these ideas seem good, right? They seem altruistic, they seem good. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about fixing the government. No matter what you do, the pendulum's going to swing back in the other direction, because inherently as humans, we're greedy, we're flawed. We're going to find a way to manipulate the system or change the system to our benefit. So the only true solution is having AI be the next government. If you think about it, if AI is itself, think about how crazy that would be, right? An AI government, or an AI run government who can take into consideration the inherent human flaws that could be, and systems that could be manipulated, and in order to create a program that could be the most beneficial for humans. That'd be kind of crazy, but
yeah, that's not going to happen.
No, it's not.
And it's you were talking about the role of government, and the problems that come up when you kind of identify some issue in isolation and try to fix it, and then it causes downstream problems with the whole. I think a big part of the solution is just to trust people, right? Just give institutions, organizations, people their autonomy, and not try to dictate every little thing from the center.
Yeah.
We all benefit when there's greater social trust.
Yeah.
And voluntary compliance.
I get that for sure. I think that there's this whole, what is it? What's the couch commentator, on the football game is saying, get up, play better. I could do your job, but then you go try to do what that football player is doing. You could never do it. And it's the same idea with just, in our HOAs, for example, just in the community I live in, there's a homeowners association. There's a charter. There's certain there's budgets for, say, the water, for the trash, and anybody who works for the HOA is it's an elected position. It's unpaid, and And so it's a hard job to do. And so, we've had a lot of issues internally with, with people with dealing with the HOA and members of the HOA and heads of the boards and stuff like that. But it's a lot harder to do it, than you'd think. So
Right.
I think we all like to, and I agree with you. So that's why I agree with you, because I think the majority of people who are in government, I'd like to give people the benefit of the doubt, are doing it for good reasons, or doing it for what they hope are, trying to make a difference. But then when they're, stonewalled and they can't make those changes once they're there because there's so much red tape to try to kind of clear, that's the hard part. But I think politicians generally do have Americans' best interest in mind, and it's hard. It's hard to be a politician, right?
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why, this importance of local governments, like you're saying, the HOA, we have so many local governments, so many elected positions in this country. And for Alexis de Tocqueville, this is how we're learning democracy. This is how, like you're saying, when you get into it, you realize, whoa, this is really tough. It's easy to sit back, criticize other people. It's easy to go on social media. But like when you're asking me, well, what would you do to get in office? Well, there's just so many things. There's so many things. And the art of it is doing what you can do, doing what's possible, which is not going to be solving whole problems, but doing it in such a way that you are keeping people's trust and building more trust. To me, that's what makes it successful. Is not an outcome that's a specific policy necessarily, or solving a specific problem, because we have to solve our own problems. Government cannot solve our problems. We have to solve our problems. There are big problems that rise to the level, the ones we've been talking about, that rise to a higher level. And there's always laws of unintended consequences. You try to solve one problem, it creates others. Right. So how do you navigate in such a dense environment? It's, I think, by focusing on the substance of politics, building these loyalties, resisting taking the easy way out, which is sacrificing the scapegoat. We always kind of want the easy way out. We want the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Members of Congress certainly want path of least resistance.
Yeah, I think a lot of Americans, and that's why a lot of people I think, voted for Trump and will be voting for Trump, is there's a sense of this anti-establishment kind of rhetoric that comes from that. And so it resonates with people, and because they're kind of fed up. They're in that sense, they're tired of feeling like they're being lied to constantly. Nothing's really changing for the better for them. I think that what you said earlier comes down to a certain level of self-drive and, doing what you can for yourself to make your community and yourself better at the end of the day, right? We all need that, right? And not to hold the government as the reason why your life is where it is today, right? Because guaranteed, as crappy as your life is, it's a lot better than it would have been 100 years ago, right? So every human, generally speaking, on this planet is better off today rather than where we were 100 years ago. So the question is, what can you do for yourself to make your life better? How much self-accountability and self-worth can you take? And then how much of the government's role is playing in your day-to-day problems? So like talking on a pragmatic level, what's affecting me personally? How much taxes I pay? Like when I think about it from that aspect in my own personal scenario, that's the only thing that I think about. Okay, if I didn't have to pay taxes, I'd have this much more money to be able to spend on this or that. So how does federal government really affect the individual, today? Like, there's certain things like, the school subsidies we talked about, and housing subsidies and stuff like that. But do you feel like there is that enough change could be done on the federal level to really affect someone on the individual level? Because I don't think there should be I don't think, for example, government handouts are the answer. You know what I mean? So I think everybody, because that disincentivizes people to work for themselves.
Right.
So Where do you draw that line between self-accountability and then, the government's here to help me for whatever reason?
Yeah, no, government policies can have huge impacts. Exactly in what you're saying. And I think the focus, if you look at ancient political thought, what do they think government should be responsible for, and what makes for good government?
That's a great question.
It's what kind of character are you building? Ultimately,
is this Aristotle in particular?
Oh, sure, yeah. Plato and Aristotle, correct. If we're going to have a city, have a polis that's going to continue and that's going to flourish, we have a constitution. We need to educate young people into that constitution.
And when you say constitution, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's is it an aristocracy? Is it a democracy? So how are these decisions going to be made? And Hellenic civilization was kind of this freakish exception to the large, heavily bureaucratic, top-down empires of other civilizations around it. Instead, there was all these small cities kind of in competition with each other. And so it was this revolutionary new way of making decisions where you take a vote. So now, holy cow, as my decision-making process, how I'm going to reason through the vote I'm going to cast in the assembly, this is really important. This is a matter of life and death. And everybody wanted to start having discussions and justifying their positions with a reason. So it was this new thing in world history. Aristotle says that's natural. That's the natural way for human beings to live and to flourish. You want to be a public person. If you're a servile person who doesn't know anything about the common order and doesn't have a share in these common decisions, the word is actually idion. Idiot is where we get the word idiot. So you don't want to be a private person. Happiness is taking part in this public.
So, and to parallel that to today, that would be serving your community, essentially, right? I mean, that's on the most basic level. And understanding what you can do as part of your community, or understanding how your community is built and being a part of that. Is that the idea?
Yeah, right. So on the national level, that's just going to be so limited.
Right.
So it is kind of an imbalance that we focus all our attention and energies on that. And it wasn't always like that. I mean, prior to Teddy Roosevelt, nobody knew who the president was. Everybody knew who their mayor was.
Right. Everybody
knew who their ward leader was. Nobody even knew who the president was. So things have really shifted. So taking part in making your community better as the substance of flourishing, being a part of that, leading and being led, politics, suggestion, response, for the sake of being friends with each other. And you say, what does the federal government mean to me as an individual? Well, it's kind of taxes. It's kind of mundane, right? In a way, it would be good to be mundane,
right?
But of course, what we have now is when it's the source of meaning, when it's this, again, sovereignty is this religious truth that we're fighting these cultural wars, and partisan battle becomes ideological struggle. And I think that's bad. I think it's secular politics where it's let's we have a problem, let's figure out clear solutions and compromise about it.
Yeah,
be much better.
I agree. I think I've been looking at Vivek Ramaswamy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's running for. I'm sure you are, but he. I like some of his policy in that it seems disruptive in a sense, a little bit he wants to dismantle the FBI. That's been part of his kind of policy change, and not necessarily get rid of all the jobs, but get rid of redundant jobs and then filter it back into the DOJ or the marshals, basically make it smaller, which I'm in favor for. But one of his big policies, and his big top points of what his policies are, is the first one is trust or faith in God is one of them. And I've always said that as much I like him I like a lot of his policy ideas, but I feel like that idea is such like a pandering idea. He's like pandering to his Republican base in that sense. Is that because there's such a large portion of the Republican Party that's has this religious faith in this idea that religion should be a part of government, and I'm not of that mindset. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against religion. I think it can be a great thing, but I don't think it should be. I agree with you. I think it should be completely separate from it and not even brought up in a sense of politics, in that we can be good people without the idea of God is my opinion, especially today, when we so I agree with you 100% about the idea of it being completely secular.
Well, let me challenge you a little bit on that, though, because I don't know if thinking about artificial intelligence government then made you think about Vivek, but it was more about GPT candidate.
Yeah, right.
But politicians pandering. Well, that's what they do, right? If you're in the business of winning people's trust and loyalty, that is kind of a cheap way to do it.
Right.
Taking a clear stance on a divisive issue is what you don't want to do. You want to speak in generalities. And this is why politicians love the phrase values, because it's kind of a way to win it can mean all kinds of things to all different people.
Whatever your values
win
are.
Their trust.
Yeah, right.
That's what I'm thinking in my head. And then they don't have to say explicitly what they mean by it. So politicians would do that. And I guess I don't have too much of a problem with that, with politicians using value discourse. And I understand the place you're trying to appeal to different constituencies by it, appealing to religion, appealing to morality. What I don't want is to take it too seriously. So that's where I kind of land in my book. Let's just not take this too seriously. And I don't see too much difference, again, in explicit, what we would call religion, which is a set of beliefs, a dogma about God and the afterlife. Between that and morality is the substitute. Morality is just a watered down version of the same thing. Because what is it? I mean, morality. It's the idea that I can know the standard by which someone else can be judged as a person, as a good person or a bad person.
Do you think that's innate, or is it taught?
How on earth? I mean, that is kind of an over the top. When you stop and think about it, I mean, what standard are you using to judge whether someone's a good person or not? Seems to me, if you want to know if someone's a good person, why don't you ask the people that know him? Why don't you ask their spouse, their children, their employees, their coworkers, their boss? It's the same as anything else. When you want to know the truth about something, you start checking with the experts. In this case, the experts are the people that know the person.
Right.
And when you check with those people and see what kind of relationships the person has with those people, then they will kind of tell you the standards that are involved. But morality short circuits all that. It's just a substitute for this divine right of kings, Erastian state, where the state controls the content of religion, which is the idea of sovereignty, is the idea of modern political thought, and really doesn't change when you just swap that out with morality. Because again, if I know that standard by which I judge a person, then what do I also know? The flip side of that is, now I know when violence can be justified. Because boy, if somebody's attacking morality, something I know is good and true and holy and sacred, then, well, that must be stopped with violence if necessary. So that's justified violence. So now, I'm not saying that there isn't such a thing as being a good person, being a bad person. That there isn't such a thing as having good relationships and having rotten relationships. That there isn't such a thing as violence that is just. But The problem is thinking about it as this abstract worldview that I possess, right? That's the modern idea of religion. Is this abstract worldview, it's this dogma that I possess as an individual. Like Luther said, you just read the Bible, it's clear. Like you don't need a church, you don't need other people, you don't need relationships with other people in a church. You have the Bible, that's all you need.
To understand what these...
Yeah, it's just read it, and that is the substance of faith, and believe in that, and you're saved. It's very, very simple. And so, I mean, that kind of goes by the wayside, and the replacement for it is morality.
Right.
Like you're saying, I can be a good person without God. Well, according to who? According to what standard?
Right.
And the problem is then it falls back into this archaic religion, into this religion where, oh my gosh, they're attacking us and their violence is immoral. So therefore, when we respond with over-the-top violence, I mean, this is what happened after 9/11. We were hurt.
Right.
We were wounded. It was awful. What did we do? We united together as a whole country, which is always a dangerous situation. You know, some scapegoat is going to happen when the whole thing unites.
Yeah.
And there's this over-the-top violence on basically a scapegoat. Saddam Hussein had nothing
to
do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was an interesting, I think, conclusion of the book as I go through the history to see, it starts with Luther and Thomas Hobbes, which really, I think, Thomas Hobbes gives this unvarnished, like the sovereign is the Leviathan, is a mortal God. It is the Pope and the King united. It's divine right of kings. This is creating truth. The sovereign is not just, a politician pandering to different people, trying to build trust in a not full information environment. No, this is a seat of power that whatever they say becomes the truth. It's like a postmodern idea.
Yeah, no, well, I agree.
It's at the center of modernity.
It gets me thinking about the idea of morality in a sense, and it's just in its definition in the first place, because as much as we all like to agree or like to think that certain values or certain essences of morality are universal or are, the truth, it is a subjective word, the idea of morality. If you were to say, what is morality? For example, women's rights in other countries across the world who don't view women's rights as women as equal today, and do not think there's any type of immoral viewpoint in taking that stance. That is not the case. That it is their view, or people who view that, let's just say hypothetically, to kill in the name of religion, regardless of what that is. The idea is they are doing a right thing by, Hamas as an example, are good thing by killing a Jew because they have been so indoctrinated to the idea of this is moral. It is right for me to kill a Jew because it is my job and my duty to do this. So the idea that morality is not it's not absolute. The idea of morality. So trying to live in a nation or live in a country with a certain set of ideas or values is just an idea of conditioning. How you're raised 100%, and therefore those are what your values are, and that's how morals are created. I don't know if that's what we would define as morals, but if you think about how some people are willing to kill in the name of whatever it is, their deity, their God, or their whatever their belief is, and others completely disagree with that, then it goes to show that the idea of morality is subjective.
Well, yeah, I mean, people can be led astray, but it's still killing. It's still cutting off that relationship with that person. So it's not just subjective, but if you're talking about that extreme of cutting off relationship with someone, such as they're killed, there's a real reality there, right? That relationship is severed. So it's really tough. This language of subjective and objective is another one of those modern categories where we're always trying to put one in one side of that ledger or the other. But relationships don't work that way. Relationships, they are subjective in the sense it's two subjects. But it's also objective because it's not up to one or the other of the people. So, I mean, there's this great French philosopher and rabbi, Emmanuel Levinas, that talks about the face of the other and, seeing God in the face of the other. So can you be kind of
is that supposed to mean compassion essentially? Seeing God in the face of the other? Is that?
Yeah, that there's this connection that persons have through empathy taken to an extreme. That when you see suffering on the face of the other, that can't be dismissed as just subjective. It's real. It's like the cry of the other is real and it involves me. So it's tough to say, is it objective? Is it subjective? Is all morality just subjective?
Right.
I mean, certainly we can be twisted. Certainly we can believe things that aren't true. I mean, I think modern political thought has led us on this direction of not focusing on the concrete realities of loyalty, trust, friendship, archaic religion. We can be blinded. We can be blinded to things. And then the question is, well, if you create your own reality, you create your own system of thought where everything's kind of justified in your bubble, like
right.
You're saying, how can that ever be pierced? So that's the question is there a reality beyond that bubble? Or are we always in this subjective bubble of this reality that we've created?
Right.
I would say with Levinas, it's the face of the other that would puncture that. It's the cry of the other where we are seeing the other is another self. It's not just all about me. It's not just all about I'm going to justify all my violence, because that's ultimately what it is when we're
right.
creating our own reality. All my violence is in a different category. It's justified. It's the violence of the other that's unjustified. But then seeing that suffering on the face of the other, that's kind of that moment where there could be conversion, where you realize, my reality's turned on its head. My bubble is pierced. There's something beyond just justify.
But do you think that is innate though? Or I would think that would be also taught. I think if you are, me and my brother in-law were talking about this, about the way people view murder as, or killing. So, think about soldiers who deal with PTSD and the way life was over 150 years ago, or even 200 years ago, how life was extremely hard, extremely short. War was going all the time, and soldiers viewed murder and killing much differently than they do today. Because, when was the last time you went and killed your own animal and skinned it and ate it? And taking a life in that sense is hard enough for us nowadays because we're so detached from that. And then you step it up to another level as far as that goes, and taking another human life. I think that we're much more in touch with and a lot, in a good way, softer in that sense than we were, say 100 years ago. But is that value of hearing the other human, of compassion, is that an innate value that's in humans, or is that something that we're just taught and it's just a function of the times that we live in?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think it's essential to being a human. So, we're not animals. We're not just kind of satisfied with basic needs. but we're open to the world. And that means open to discourse, to language, which is taught. So if you take a child and raise them and nobody says anything to them, they are not going to develop that capacity. And there's a famous instance of this child who was living like an animal because
Tarzan?
it was basically this scenario in the jungle of this child that they studied who did not have the capacity for language. So even the things most intimate to ourselves, the other is present, right? Language is the way we are thinking and expressing our own desires and actions as an individual. And yet, where did that come from? That came from without. Somebody had to teach us
right.
the meaning of that word.
Right.
And then we have it, it's an achievement, and we can use that and make it further achievement.
It's true. The fundamental act of communicating, the fact that you and I are able to sit here and talk about morality in the first place and be able to distinguish between that is a value of or a function of something that we were taught. Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's deep within the human heart that we're persons, which means in relation. We exist in relation. That's why we're open to the world, why we're not animals, because we can form relationships and think and intend and speak with other persons to everything in the whole universe. And other people form their own locus of that ability and form a special part of us. Each relationship we have with each individual person is a special one. So each person is a little world of their own. So I think, obviously you can become as desensitized and as brutal, and as twisted, a person, worse than an animal, right? That can definitely happen. But that doesn't mean everything's subjective or up for grabs. I mean, that's clearly bad, distorted relationships with others. So yes, I think it's innate in the sense of the kind of beings we are.
Right. We're social beings and by nature.
Social beings by nature.
Yeah. So if you take like the current conflict with the conflict going on in Israel right now, on social media, I'm scrolling through and I'm seeing, I feel like there's a lot of things that are lost in translation too with people. A lot of posts that I go through say, free Palestine. And then a lot of posts I see, are, I stand with Israel. So there's this definite barricade. And I think people have confused Hamas is in Palestinian territory, and they're using Palestinians as shields supposedly, and so a lot of people who are on the Free Palestine bandwagon or on the train are saying this because they believe that Jews are on land that doesn't belong to them in the first place, and they've taken over Israel, a large chunk of Israel. So there's, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of possibly what's happened in the past. So how do you reconcile the innocents that are the innocent Palestinians that are there, and the Israelis that are trying to stop these attacks from happening again? And how do we as people get past this and come to this point of friendship and understanding? Where is the how do we get past this?
Yeah. Well, I love Israel. I've been there 5 times. And there's this quote I've spent a long time looking for and cannot find. I think it was a French philosopher, maybe Henri Bergson, who said it. And it's anyone who learns the language of another people can never entirely be their enemy. So it's kind of that idea that we've been talking about, like even the most intimate part of ourselves as persons is acquired through other people. So I just remember, this might have been 20 years ago, reading in The Economist, or maybe it was one of my trips to Israel, how even the Arabic speaking Jews in Israel were kind of embarrassed and making sure their children knew Hebrew, but not teaching them Arabic. I thought, oh boy,
right?
It's not a good thing. And it was I don't know if it was Barghouti or it was someone in a Palestinian leader who was in prison and had learned Hebrew in the prison. That I think I read that in The Economist. And I remember thinking, oh, that's great. That's good for peace. If you get these Palestinian leaders learning Hebrew, Israelis learning Arabic, because even though I can't remember who said it, that just strikes me as really true. If you spend the time and you've invested the time learning a foreign language, it's hard to otherize the people and completely sweep them aside. Precisely what you're describing is the level of empathy and understanding we want to get to, where it's my children, right? I love my children, my fellow countrymen's children, but then we've got to have the same level of concern with children in Gaza, right? So it's that expanding circles of loyalty. Now, a lot of contemporary thought and coming out of this modern political tradition will oppose these levels of the universal level with the local particularist level. I love my family specially and my country, but that's a particular special interest. And to really get to the level of universal reason, we kind of need to suppress that, as if the two are in competition with each other.
And instead espouse what?
Well, so this is what I would strongly make the case for in my book, is they're not in competition.
Oh, okay.
You build up the one from the other. Just like we learn language from other people, we will learn, the higher level, the greater level, the more universal level is the more comprehensive level. And we get there not by squashing that's the shortcut. That's you believe you're loyal to your little tribe, but I'm talking about universal reason here. Well, the problem with that is then, who's your universal reason? That's your universal reason. I believe something different. And now we're back in this liberal paradigm of where the state have to step in and have a magical decision on what is just.
Right.
But the reality is loyalties amongst two people expanding into groups. Let's not sacrifice scapegoats. But to do that's difficult. To do that means our relationship needs to be deepened. If we're not casually sacrificing scapegoats, that means we've got to work out our disagreements amongst ourselves. We have fierce disagreements. We have to learn to be friends without just taking the shortcut of putting it on a third party, which means the third party could be included. The third party is another potential friend. So the networks can expand by becoming more comprehensive rather than this glib, superficial, we believe in Western reason, you believe in tribalism. So the way to get to the universal is by squashing the particular.
I get that. That makes sense. And in the case of Israel and Palestine, is the unfortunate the unfortunate repercussions of innocent lives being lost is a group that is not a moral group, as we were talking about earlier, as morality is something that's innate in that, and the idea that wanting to kill somebody because of whatever their beliefs are is not natural within us as humans, right? Like you said, it's something that either you're a victim of your environment or your circumstance to be thinking these things, right? To be taught that someone is so evil that they deserve to die, and being taught that since you were a little kid, and as a Hamas, a kid growing up under Hamas indoctrination, believing that every Jew that needs to be killed is a perversion of morality, would you say?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, that's total indoctrination. I mean, that's yeah, the Carl Schmitt politics is about defining friends and enemies, right? And what I would take to be symptomatic of this flaw in modern political thought, like the sovereign is making these determinations. Fundamentally, the sovereign in Thomas Hobbes's theories is defining friend and enemy, who's in and who's out. And if you're opposing the narrative, you're out, right? And that just continues to foment this belief that there is this seat of power that can determine morality, and that we're all mystically united in this body, is this set of theoretical ideas that is not compatible with the actual reality of political life. Of some things are bad, some things are good.
Right.
You're teaching your children to sacrifice scapegoats. You're teaching the children to exclude innocent parties. Like, that is not leading to the point of all human flourishing, which, according to Aristotle's Political, according to Thomas Aquinas' friendship, right, is living in peace and harmony with others.
Yep, that sounds about right. That's great. There's one other topic I want to quickly go over. Mentioning Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, politically today, what are the same? Where do we stand politically, and say parallel to maybe not Greek, but like say Rome? And are there any parallels between where we stand politically and the decline of America as it's going? And can we draw any parallels to, like, say, Rome and its decline specifically? Or any specific instances or examples?
Oh, sure. And, a classicist would be better answering this. I mean, the inability to practice civic virtue, and that loss of trust, and that self-serving of the elites, and the civil wars, and the bread and circuses. I think there's a lot of parallels that could be made with the decline of other civilizations. The entrenched special interests we've been talking about, where it's difficult to act for the public good. The military overexpansion. I mean, and that's true in the history of Athens as well. Invasion of Syracuse.
Just tried to expand,
trying to do too much.
Right.
Trying to do too much. Trying to live beyond your means. I mean, when you get big and rich and powerful, there's such an opportunity for the upper classes to really make it big, and then you're losing that the as the Romans saw, that old patriotic virtues of piety, and what is it all about? Is it about being content with what you have and your service to the common good? If the ruling class is taking pride in that collective achievement, then yes, then you're a part of that, and that's part of it. But as soon as it goes to, enriching lining pockets of the elites at the expense of the common weal, then it's tough to recapture. That's what we see in the history of Rome, and it leads to this loss of faith and trust in the institutions,
right?
Which then leads to the centralization of power. So, I mean, are we going to see that? I mean, there's since 2016 election talk along these lines, right? Are we going the way of
towards a civil war of some sort, or
civil war disorder, but also, I mean, the classic pattern is the man on horseback, right? You have some kind of tyrant who says they're going to solve their problems for you. Just give me all the power, but then you no longer have the Roman Republic; you have the Roman Empire.
Right.
So, could that happen in America? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen.
Maybe not politically. I don't know if from like a purely political in a purely political sense. I don't know if that would happen as likely as, say, socially within its people, like the population losing a sense of nationalism or a sense of identity of what the country is to be united, and people to become more divided, and that break out into some sort of like civil war without there being need a change of drastic political change within the federal government.
So I mean, history never repeats itself exactly, and we have these parallels. 1500s, obviously, the history of Rome. So, I mean, Martin Gurry and his book Revolt of the Public paints this picture of just this kind of standoff where the older institutions that have been hollowed out of trust and have kind of been exposed as these self-seeking elites enriching themselves at the expense of the public purse, those continue on because there's kind of no alternative to them. But then you have the populace that is like seething with rage and has access to all this information that's exposing the failures of the governing class, kind of just at odds with each other without one side having a victory. So he said it's like after the Protestant Reformation, these wars, Catholics versus Protestants. It was the princes fighting to create the modern state, using religion to justify what they were doing. But if we said, well, who won, Catholics or Protestants? If they said that to us, who won, Catholics or Protestants? We say, well, neither. A new entity was created, a new order was created. So I think he's onto something there. I mean, a really interesting comment Joe Biden made when he was talking about the Second Amendment. He's like, "Oh, you want your guns? I know you think the tree of liberty is watered with the blood of tyrants, but you're going to need more than an AR-15. You're going to need an F-16. And that was, I thought, Biden's great because he'll just blurt things out and he'll get into it with you and kind of, let's take this outside when you disagree with him.
Yeah.
But that was a really, I think, we'll see where things go, but that could be like this little prophetic remark.
Right.
I mean, we've fought these wars and engaged in this, population control, guerrilla warfare, what Iraq turned into. I mean, could that be the case in this country?
Well,
I don't know.
I had this my other brother-in-law, who's a staunch 2A amendment activist or supporter. We had this exact same exchange about Americans being able to stand up and protect themselves and use their firearms to protect themselves in case of this happening. And he used what happened 20 years ago in Iraq as a perfect example of how we had soldiers come in there. We tried to change things around, and we weren't able to do anything about it. Essentially, right? Billions, trillions of dollars just spent, and where are we now as opposed to where we were 20 years ago in that sense. In
How interesting.
Yeah. And so I agree with you. This was exactly the same conversation we had. And so I agree that is that something that could happen here in the States? Well, at least we would have the firearms to be able to protect ourselves if that happened. But I'd like for it to not have to come to that.
Yeah.
I think the biggest culprit at the end of the day is social media. I think it's shed a light, but it's also shed a lot of division between people that's not there at the end of the day. And I think going out and befriending your fellow, your friends in your community and trying to be a part of the community is a great step towards actually achieving something positive and something good that can lead to something. And understanding law and understanding the way our system runs. A lot of people, knowledge is power, and a lot of people don't understand that a lot of people don't even know how our government works in itself, how the branches of government work within each other, how laws are passed. And before you can be this, couch football warrior, like I call it, who's coaching from the couch, you need to understand how it's built and try to make change and enact change for yourself. So I think that's the biggest takeaway. I don't know, I don't know where we stand to go from here. I don't know what we can do to help, unite everything, unite Americans and the state of where we are politically today. Go ahead.
I would just say we don't necessarily want to. I always get nervous when we're trying to unite everyone. Because again, that's what happened after 9/11, and you're just looking for scapegoats to see sacrificed when that happens. What we want is conflict, but the right type of conflict. We want conflict where the parties involved respect each other. So, social media, it's a platform, and the problem is us. The problem is how we're using it. If you're treating people poorly online, it's not a fault of the platform. That's your fault. So it kind of exposed, we're in this low trust society, and it kind of exposed that. But act in trustworthy ways, whether that's online or whether that's in person, and then moderate your expectations. Right? It's not about it's not the source of meaning. Really, the government is not sovereign. Really, we have the power to treat others the way we want to be treated. And it's not just all coming from the sovereign power.
That's a great, probably the best lesson I've learned today. And I think I'm going to have a lot to take home with me, because I think, because of social media, it exacerbates our emotions sometimes, and we can get really angry at things that necessarily aren't worth getting angry towards, like you said, finding the scapegoat. And I think at the end of the day, looking at, it's good to look at the positive and to look at the good within your neighbor, your friends, and what you can control versus just seething online and spouting hateful stuff to your fellow people.
I think at some point in time in the future, there will be a set of mores, a set of expectations that we will develop. It's such a new thing. But in the future, parents are going to treat their children certain protocols that didn't exist in the past 25 years with the creation of the internet.
Virtual social protocols or something, right?
Yeah, or even just, when you're in the presence of another person, you're not looking at your phone. Like that's a piece of etiquette and politeness that we do not currently have. Will something like that exist in the future? It very well might. We might work our way to a point where, okay, this is how we are going to live with this technology. Technologies are great. They can be very helpful. They're kind of neutral. It's us. It's how we use it.
Yeah, absolutely. If we integrate with technology, we'll have the screens in our eyes. So I'll be looking at you through the screen. No, but I agree. I think a lot of that's been lost too. I think I don't know if this is just me as I get older, noticing this. Maybe I was like this when I was younger, but a lot of younger kids, I'll say younger, maybe in their 20s, 20s to 30s, there is this kind of social disconnect that I've found while interacting with them. And I don't know if this is just a social awkwardness, just because that's how most kids are at in their very early 20s and late teens, because they haven't quite found themselves. They don't have that sense of confidence to be able to look at somebody in the eyes and communicate with them that way. But I've noticed that a lot with kids, just, people who work at the gym that I go to, for example, who tend to be younger and just have a very, or people in the service industry who, when I go to a restaurant, there seems to be this, it seems like it has changed, but maybe I'm just getting old and cynical, but this kind of barrier between us and the person they're helping us, or the person I'm communicating with. There's this lack of connection, and that starts with the eyes making contact, and probably has a lot to do with social media, with kids being, growing up. I didn't, social media Facebook was out in 2000. I joined Facebook in 2006. I already graduated college. I didn't have a cell phone in my hand since I was 8 years old or 6 or something like that. And so many of these kids, that's their reality, that their sense of self and who they are is built into these screens, which is why we limit it with our kids for sure, like to no social media, especially for our kids. But I think that that's a big factor, and hopefully it comes back to this communication that we can have, this connection that we don't have anymore.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, there's a great book, John Twaney's iGen. Is the book to read. So it's really important to those of us who are educating this generation that has grown up with the
what's it called?
It's called iGen.
iGen, okay.
Yeah, about the generation that's grown up with the internet and all the problems that's caused.
Yeah.
All the anxiety and things you're describing.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Thanks so much for coming. I appreciate it. This was great. I learned a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It was fun.